Hello, everybody. Yanis Varoufakis gave an interesting interview this weekend that I want to talk about with you because I think he's hitting the nail on the head. He was talking to Democracy Now! And he was being asked about his opinion of what the NATO and G7 summits in Europe meant. And let's just listen into this. It's 2.5 minutes, and let me comment about what he says.
There is an unprecedented show of unity within the West. But what is lacking are two things, Amy, if I may say. Firstly, an appreciation of the fact that the rest of the world is not showing complete alignment with the West. This is an understatement.
That's the first thing. This is absolutely right. If you look at popular media online and in mass media, what kind of impression you get if you're sitting in the West is that the world is condemning what Russia is doing and is on board with all of the sanctions, etc. But a friend of mine sent me this picture here that kind of makes the point quite well. If the West talks about the world looks like this: North America, Europe, Japan, and Australia, New Zealand, right? So let's just keep this in mind. That's not to say that what Russia is doing is right, and this is certainly not to say that that there should be no sanctions or something. It's just when we perceive what's happening about international relations and who's on board with what, let's just be careful not to overstate the current state of affairs, right? Because yes, Russia is under a lot of pressure, and yes, this is quite unprecedented in terms of how heavy and strict the sanctions are, and also the neutrals like Switzerland and Sweden and Austria being on board with the sanctions is certainly a new thing. But there are large parts of the world that are not on board. They include China and India and most of Central Asia, Serbia as well, right? I mean, there's a lot of countries that do not quite follow that course. Let's just be mindful of that.
Even though the majority of countries in the United Nations voted against Russia, if you look at the countries that didn't, they contain more than half of the population of the world, including not just China, but also India and many other countries. The second thing that's missing from this show of strength and the impressive sanctions that have been agreed against Putin and his henchmen is a game plan. Exactly what is President Biden aiming for?
And this is crucial. It's like, what's the goal? Okay, what we hear is the sanctions are supposed to make Russia stop. Yeah, but stop and then do what? Because the other thing that we constantly hear about is how horrible Mr. Putin is and how it's impossible to make any deals with him. So if a deal is not the goal, then what is? Mr. Varoufakis gets this right.
Yes, it is important for him and for his government, for his administration, to show support for the Ukrainians, to provide Stinger missiles, to provide economic sanctions for Putin, which, of course, we know are not going to debilitate the Putin regime. But what is exactly the aim? Is it regime change in Russia? Well, whenever the United States tried regime change, it didn't turn out very well, and has never been tried with a nuclear power. This is like playing with fire, or nuclear fire, I should say. If it's not regime change, what exactly is it? And so allow me to just say this, that the famed philosopher and military strategist from China, 𝗔𝗯cie, once said that if you are faced with a formidable enemy whose total defeat is going to kill many or most of your people as well, what you should do, 𝗔𝗯cie said, was to build a golden bridge behind your enemy from which your enemy can escape, to give him an opportunity to withdraw while claiming that he has achieved something. Now, Biden, by proclaiming that Putin is a war criminal, I have no doubt that Putin is a very nasty piece of work. I've called him a war criminal 20 years ago over his massacre of Chechens in Grozny. But what is the leader of the United States doing? What is he aiming at? Because if he's not leaving any room for a compromise, then he's effectively jeopardizing the interests of Ukrainians, because a quagmire in an Afghanistan-like quagmire in the Ukraine is not exactly in the interests of any Ukrainian I know of.
And I think this is absolutely central. The only alternative to a negotiated end to the war in Ukraine is a protracted, long, ongoing guerrilla war of the kind that we've seen in Afghanistan. And we've seen how horrible that was, 20 years, and grinding society to death, right? And 20 years is an understatement, because that doesn't include the first 20 years when, after the Russians invaded, right? 40 years, basically, of horrible warfare and guerrilla tactics. And if that is the goal for Ukraine, then let's not kid ourselves. This is going to be devastating for the Ukrainians. So if the goal is to save lives, then what has to happen is some form of negotiation, even if the West doesn't like the idea of negotiating with a man who is being portrayed as being the second coming of Hitler, right? But there is no alternative. It's either negotiation and a negotiated end, or it's a continuing war, and continuing war will be horrible. It will be horrible for the Ukrainians, and it will be horrible for the Russians, no doubt. And it will probably be horrible for a big part of Europe. So that's just, we need to keep that in mind. And the other thing is the just the sheer fact that almost all wars end with an agreement. I mean, even Japan, when it surrendered, agreed to its surrender. Japan had the possibility to continue its warfare back in 1945. And luckily, they decided against it. They decided to sign the Declaration of Surrender in order to stop the bombings, right, in August, September 45. So at some point, someone needs to just do that step and say, like, we need to stop the killing, even if it means to sign a document that everything inside us kind of feels repulsive about. I'm not saying that Ukraine should be giving up or something, but the awareness needs to be there that if we want this this war to end soon, it needs to be a negotiated end. And Mr. Varoufakis gets this very right. And what he calls the golden parachute is this neutrality agreement, which in my view is the most likely way to end that war, because it's probably the one thing that all sides can agree on. The Russians, we know that they want it. The Ukrainians used to be neutral until 2014, and the West could probably somehow even say yes to that. But let's face it. I mean, the West has the least leverage over this. So the real players here are the Ukrainians and the Russians, which could agree on this. It's probably not even the neutrality that at this point is the large point of contestation, but more the other points that the Russians lined out, like demilitarization and denazification, which probably still means regime change in the jargon of Mr. Putin. We don't know that. That's going to be what needs to be figured out. But this golden bridge and the idea that there needs to be a negotiation, even if the negotiation is with somebody that is guilty of an attack, that appreciation is important. I hope we'll get there. Thank you.